Jerome stood in the center of the grand ballroom, champagne glasses shattering against marble floors, like explosions of his breaking heart. Victoria pointed at him, with perfectly manicured nails, her designer gown shimmering under crystal chandeliers, as 300 guests turned to stare at the man in grease-stained work clothes. Security guards moved toward him, while her laughter cut through the whispers like a blade. She had called him an hour ago, her voice desperate and sweet, begging him to come to this party because she needed to see him urgently. He had rushed straight from the garage, still smelling of motor oil and honest work, clutching the small velvet box that represented 6 months of saved pennies and skipped meals. Now he understood the real reason for her call. She wanted an audience for his destruction. The man beside her, smooth and polished, in an expensive tailored suit with a gold watch catching the light, pulled her close possessively while announcing he owned 3 car dealerships. Victoria's voice dripped with theatrical cruelty as she asked Jerome what he owned besides a toolbox, and the crowd erupted in laughter that felt like physical blows. But the deepest cut came from seeing his own cousin Bernard, standing among the laughing faces, slapping the rich man's shoulder like they were old friends. His betrayal somehow worse than Victoria's, because they shared blood and history and the sacred memory of Mama Ruth, who had loved them both. Jerome's story began not with money, but with abandonment and unexpected grace. They found him wrapped in a thin blanket outside Mount Zion Baptist Church on a frozen February morning when he was barely a week old, his tiny fingers already reaching for warmth that his birth mother hadn't provided. Mama Ruth, the church custodian, who had already raised 6 children of her own and buried a husband she loved, took one look at the crying infant and declared that the Lord was giving her one more soul to love, even though she was 73 years old and living on a fixed income. She gave him the bedroom in their cramped one-room apartment while she slept on a worn couch that sagged in the middle, waking before dawn every morning to make breakfast from whatever they had, sometimes just buttered bread and weak tea, served with unconditional love. Education was her religion, and she would tap his homework with her weathered finger while insisting that learning was his ticket to a better life. But she always added that character was what you carried when all the tickets ran out. Jerome got his first job at 12, bagging groceries at Morrison's Market for $3 an hour. And by 14, he was washing cars at Carl's Auto Body after school, scrubbing away dirt and grime while dreaming of something bigger. Mr. Carl caught him staring under the hood of a vintage Mustang one Saturday afternoon, mesmerized by the intricate dance of pistons and valves, and asked if he was interested in more than soap and water, eventually teaching him everything about engines and transmissions and the poetry of mechanical systems working in perfect harmony. Everything changed when Mama Ruth got sick during Jerome's 17th year. The hospital bills arrived like an avalanche, each envelope containing numbers that made his hands shake and his stomach twist with helpless rage against a system that charged thousands for mercy. Her medications cost more than their monthly rent, and Jerome worked double shifts at the garage while dropping out of his certification courses, picking up weekend jobs, delivering newspapers, and stocking shelves at night, sleeping 4 hours if he was lucky. Bernard appeared during those dark months, like an answer to desperate prayers, bringing groceries and paying utilities while talking about family responsibility and Christian duty, hugging Mama Ruth with tears in his eyes while she whispered that God had sent her 2 grandsons to love. Jerome trusted him completely during those terrible months, signing papers without reading them because grief had made him stupid and gratitude had made him blind, never questioning why Bernard volunteered so quickly to handle all the estate planning and insurance paperwork. Mama Ruth passed on a quiet Sunday morning, holding both their hands while her last words urged them to love each other, because that was all that truly mattered in this world. Bernard sobbed louder than anyone at the funeral, delivering a beautiful eulogy about her legacy of love that made the church mothers weep and embrace him. And Jerome never noticed how quickly his cousin offered to manage the $15,000 life insurance policy, suggesting that Jerome shouldn't worry about complicated paperwork while drowning in grief and confusion. 2 months after the funeral, Jerome finally asked about Mama Ruth's insurance money, expecting to receive his half so he could pay down the mountain of medical debt that haunted his mailbox. Bernard looked genuinely confused, his face a mask of concern and sympathy, as he explained that the policy had barely covered funeral costs and showed Jerome statements that looked official and final. Jerome knew he had seen the original policy at Mama Ruth's apartment, listing $30,000 in benefits. But Bernard suggested gently that grief sometimes distorted memories, and perhaps Jerome should consider talking to a professional counselor about his confusion. He let it go, because Bernard was family, and Mama Ruth had taught him that blood meant loyalty, never imagining that his cousin had forged his signature and stolen $15,000 while their grandmother's body was still warm in the ground. That same month, Victoria walked into Carl's auto body, like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, wearing a yellow dress and expensive perfume, complaining about transmission problems in her Mercedes with an entitled tone that somehow charmed rather than irritated him. She kept returning week after week, with minor issues that seemed increasingly manufactured, and eventually asked Jerome to dinner at a soul food restaurant, where they talked for hours about her real estate career and his passion for restoration projects. They dated for 8 months, and she seemed genuinely interested in his dreams and ambitions, never complaining about his small apartment or second-hand clothes. Though looking back, he could see the red flags he had ignored like a fool, desperate for love. Victoria never invited Jerome to her office parties or introduced him to her parents, always changing the subject when he suggested meeting her family or friends. She would ask him to park around the corner when picking her up from certain neighborhoods, explaining that her shallow friends wouldn't understand their relationship, and she wanted to protect what they had from toxic opinions and jealous commentary. Jerome thought she was being protective of their love, not understanding that she was actually protecting her carefully constructed image from the contamination of his working-class reality. Bernard stayed close during those months too, suddenly flush with money from a supposed promotion at the bank, moving into a luxury downtown apartment, and driving a new BMW that seemed impossibly expensive for his stated salary. When Jerome asked how he afforded such extravagance, Bernard laughed and talked vaguely about smart investments and opportunities, offering to help Jerome build wealth with his garage savings, never revealing that he was systematically defrauding elderly clients at his bank while collecting rent on Mama Ruth's stolen house. The night Jerome finally saved enough to buy Victoria's engagement ring, he called Bernard in excitement to share the news that he was proposing next week, and his cousin's voice sounded strange and hollow as he wished him good luck in a tone that should have served as a warning. 3 days later, Victoria called with that urgent summons to the party, and 3 days later, Jerome discovered that his entire life had been a carefully orchestrated performance, with himself cast as the fool everyone pitied behind closed doors. Jerome drove home from the engagement party in a daze, Victoria's theatrical cruelty and the crowd's laughter still echoing in his skull like a curse he couldn't escape. His apartment felt smaller and emptier than ever as he sat on Mama Ruth's old couch, staring at the velvet ring box and wondering how he had misread everything so completely. His phone buzzed with a text from Bernard, expressing fake sympathy and claiming he had just heard about the party disaster, But Jerome remembered seeing his cousin standing with Victoria's new fiancé Darnell, like they were brothers who shared secrets and schemes. The next morning at the garage, Mr. Carl noticed Jerome's devastated mood and listened quietly as the whole story poured out in bitter waves of humiliation and betrayal. After a long silence, Mr. Carl revealed something that made Jerome's blood run cold with dawning understanding. Bernard had come by the garage 2 months earlier, asking detailed questions about Jerome's income, savings, and assets with an intensity that made the old mechanic suspicious and protective. Mr. Carl warned Jerome to be careful because his cousin had what he called snake eyes, the look of a predator measuring prey. And that warning finally opened Jerome's eyes to the larger conspiracy that had shaped his recent life. That afternoon, Jerome drove to Mama Ruth's old apartment, which the landlord still hadn't rented, and searched through boxes until he found her important documents folder containing the life insurance policy, clearly stating $30,000 split equally between two beneficiaries named Jerome Mitchell and Bernard Mitchell, with no exceptions or amendments listed anywhere on the official pages. The insurance company records confirmed that the policy had paid out in full, with the entire check issued to Bernard Mitchell as primary executor of the estate. The insurance company records confirmed that the policy had paid out in full, with the entire check issued to Bernard Mitchell as primary executor of the estate. The representative showed Jerome a beneficiary waiver form bearing his signature and dated 2 weeks after Mama Ruth's funeral, legally transferring his portion to his cousin without any contest or conditions. Jerome stared at that signature, recognizing the general shape, but noticing that the letter J was too looped when he always wrote it straight, and he realized with certainty that Bernard had forged the document and stolen $15,000 while pretending to grieve alongside him. He requested copies of everything and spent that night studying each page with growing rage, trying to understand how someone could betray family so casually and completely. His phone rang with an unknown number, and a nervous woman named Patricia identified herself as someone from Victoria's real estate office who had attended that awful company picnic months ago. She explained that she probably shouldn't be calling, but felt guilty about staying silent when she had witnessed the conspiracy taking shape over happy hour drinks and office gossip sessions. Patricia revealed that Victoria and Darnell had met 4 months before the engagement party through Bernard's introduction at some investment seminar, and Bernard had explicitly described Jerome as Victoria's temporary situation until someone worthy came along, making everyone laugh about the poor mechanic who didn't know his place. The conspiracy had been planned for months, orchestrated by Jerome's own cousin as some twisted lesson about staying in your lane and accepting your station in life without aspiring to things like love and respect that Bernard apparently believed were reserved for better people than garage workers and orphans. Jerome felt like he was drowning in revelations, each new piece of information reshaping his understanding of recent years and revealing patterns of manipulation he had missed. He remembered something Mama Ruth had said near the end, after one of Bernard's visits, when she looked troubled and distant. She had gripped Jerome's hand with surprising strength and warned him that Bernard had hungry eyes, the look of someone who had been watching Jerome earn respect and love since childhood and resented him for possessing things that couldn't be bought or stolen. She had made Jerome promise to be careful and never let anyone steal his light, and he had failed that promise by trusting too easily and believing that blood meant loyalty. The next day, Jerome hired a lawyer named Simone, who worked pro bono cases from a small downtown office, showing her the insurance documents and Patricia's testimony, along with a timeline of suspicious events. Simone studied everything carefully before explaining that proving forgery required expensive handwriting experts. But she knew a retired forensic examiner named Dr. Henrietta Cross, who might help after hearing the circumstances of the case. Meanwhile, Bernard started calling and texting with increasing frequency, suggesting they talk and clear the air, while warning that families shouldn't let outsiders cause problems with their malicious gossip and lies. Jerome ignored every message because he finally understood that Bernard wasn't family in any meaningful sense, just a predator who happened to share DNA and had weaponized that connection for his own benefit and entertainment. Dr. Cross was a 70-year-old black woman with silver hair and sharp eyes who studied Jerome's legitimate signatures alongside the forged waiver for 30 careful minutes. She finally looked up and announced with professional certainty that someone had traced Jerome's signature using a lightbox or window, creating hesitation marks and tremors that genuine signatures never contained. She agreed to testify and insisted that Jerome file a police report immediately because forgery was a serious crime that deserved prosecutions and punishment. Detective Wallace took Jerome's statement with visible skepticism, warning that family cases were complicated and messy, and asking multiple times if Jerome was absolutely certain he wanted to pursue charges against his own cousin. Jerome answered that Bernard stopped being family the moment he forged documents and stole from their dying grandmother while pretending to cry at her bedside. 3 days after filing the police report, Jerome received legal papers informing him that Bernard was suing him for defamation, claiming $50,000 in damages for spreading malicious lies designed to destroy his hard-earned reputation in the banking community. The lawsuit was filed by some prestigious downtown law firm that charged $500 per hour, and Simone explained that this was a slap suit designed to scare Jerome into dropping his criminal complaint through intimidation and threatened financial ruin. She told Jerome to gather every financial document from when Bernard was supposedly helping with Mama Ruth's affairs, promising to dig deeper because she suspected the insurance money was just the visible tip of a much larger criminal iceberg. Jerome spent an entire night sorting through boxes of Mama Ruth's meticulous records, finding bank statements and utility bills and receipts, organized by year and category with her characteristic precision. That's when he discovered the property deed, showing that Mama Ruth had owned the small row house she lived in for 40 years, having paid off the mortgage in 1998, when Jerome was just a child learning to read. According to these documents, she had transferred the deed to Bernard for estate planning purposes 1 month before her death, supposedly signing complex legal papers during the exact period when she was heavily medicated and barely conscious from the brain tumor that was killing her. Jerome drove past the house the next day and saw new tenants living there, young families who were unknowingly paying rent to a thief who had stolen property from a dying woman. He called Simone immediately with shaking hands and explained that Bernard had stolen not just insurance money, but an entire house worth at least $70,000 in that neighborhood, collecting rent for 3 years while letting Jerome struggle with medical debts and funeral costs. Simone's voice turned to steel as she promised they weren't just filing criminal charges anymore, but would burn Bernard's entire world to the ground and expose every crime he had committed against vulnerable people. The investigation expanded rapidly as the bank's fraud division discovered that Bernard had been systematically stealing from elderly clients for years, taking small amounts from accounts belonging to people who wouldn't notice missing funds or wouldn't be believed if they complained about the nice young banker who visited them with flowers and empty smiles. The confrontation happened at Mount Zion Baptist Church during a charity fundraiser that Bernard had organized to honor Mama Ruth's legacy with theatrical irony. He had invited half the community to witness his performance as the devoted grandson, setting up a scholarship fund and displaying photographs of Mama Ruth around the fellowship hall while giving speeches about family values and giving back. Bernard stood at the podium in an expensive suit, his voice trembling with fake emotion, as he explained how Mama Ruth taught him that communities were only as strong as their weakest members, which is why he was establishing this scholarship for hard-working young people who believed in dignity and honest effort. The crowd applauded his generosity, while church mothers dabbed their eyes with handkerchiefs, completely fooled by his mask of compassion and remembrance. Victoria attended the event too, sitting in the back row with Darnell, and her eyes met Jerome's when he walked through the door with something like shame flickering across her face before she looked away. Pastor Williams approached Jerome with a warm smile and commented on how wonderful Bernard's work was in preserving Mama Ruth's memory, completely unaware that he was praising a thief and a fraud who had stolen from the very woman he claimed to honor. Bernard presented a giant ceremonial check for $10,000 to the scholarship fund, posing for photographs while the audience applauded his apparent generosity, never imagining that the money came from an elderly woman's bank account that he had drained without authorization or conscience. The testimonials section of the program featured community members sharing stories about Mama Ruth's kindness and strength and unconditional love for everyone she encountered. Finally, Bernard returned to the microphone and called Jerome to the front, asking him to share a few words about the grandmother who had raised them both with such devotion and sacrifice. The room turned toward Jerome with expectant faces and warm smiles as he walked slowly to the podium, taking the microphone from Bernard's hand. While their eyes met, and Jerome saw a flicker of nervousness behind his cousin's polished confidence. Jerome thanked everyone for coming and acknowledged that Mama Ruth would be touched by the turnout, then explained that she loved this church and this community and believed in truth above all things, quoting her favorite saying that truth was like dawn and couldn't be stopped from coming no matter how much darkness tried to delay it. He pulled out a folder from his jacket and began methodically destroying Bernard's carefully constructed lies with documented evidence and expert testimony. Jerome described the life insurance policy worth $30,000 that Bernard had stolen by forging a signature, holding up Dr. Cross's forensic analysis confirming the forgery with scientific certainty. Gasps rippled through the fellowship hall as Bernard's face went pale, and he tried to claim defamation. But Jerome wasn't finished with his revelations and continued with the story of Mama Ruth's house that Bernard had stolen while she was dying and barely conscious from heavy medications. The crowd's shocked whispers grew louder as Jerome explained how Bernard had been collecting rent on Mama Ruth's property for 3 years while letting his cousin drown in medical debt. Pastor Williams stood up, looking devastated and confused, trying to make sense of these serious accusations against someone he had trusted and celebrated. Victoria suddenly stood up, despite Darnell trying to pull her back down, and she walked to the front of the church with trembling hands and mascara already running down her face in dark streams. She announced that she needed to say something truthful for once in her shallow life, explaining how Bernard had introduced her to Darnell 4 months before the breakup and orchestrated the entire humiliation at the engagement party, like it was some kind of business transaction designed to teach Jerome a lesson about knowing his place. Victoria described how Bernard had shown her financial projections and talked about lifestyle costs, convincing her that Jerome would trap her in poverty and that she deserved better than a mechanic who smelled like gasoline and honest work. Patricia stood up next, holding her phone high and announcing that she had saved text messages between Bernard and Victoria. And Darnell, proving the conspiracy in their own words, messages that treated Jerome's public humiliation like entertainment and sport. The fellowship hall erupted in shocked conversations and angry murmurs as people struggled to reconcile the Bernard they thought they knew with the calculating predator being exposed before their eyes. Detective Wallace entered through the back door with another officer and a prosecutor named Simone, and he announced in a formal voice that Bernard Mitchell was under arrest for fraud, forgery, and identity theft. Bernard backed away from the podium desperately, shouting that this was all a setup and that Jerome was lying out of jealousy and instability, reminding everyone that he was a respected bank executive who ran charity events and helped his community. Simone's voice cut through his protests like a blade, explaining that they had found 7 other victims beyond Jerome's case, elderly clients at Bernard's bank who had been systematically defrauded for years through small transfers that wouldn't trigger immediate suspicion. Detective Wallace added that the total theft exceeded $200,000 and that the bank's fraud division had been investigating Bernard for months, with Jerome's case providing the final evidence they needed to build an airtight prosecution. Bernard looked around desperately at the church mothers who had praised him and the pastor who had trusted him and the community he had fooled so completely, shouting that he had given them scholarship money and helped people in need. Simone calmly explained that the $10,000 he had just presented actually came from a 93-year-old woman's account through unauthorized transfers, and the handcuffs clicked around Bernard's wrists with a sound that echoed through the silent fellowship hall like a judge's gavel falling on final judgment. As officers led Bernard toward the back exit, he locked eyes with Jerome one final time and hissed that Jerome had always been jealous of his ambition while playing with cars like a child. Jerome responded quietly that he had possessed something Bernard never could, which was Mama Ruth's genuine love, given freely without manipulation or theft, and Bernard couldn't stand that reality because it exposed the emptiness at the center of his entire existence. They took Bernard out through the back entrance, while the fellowship hall remained frozen in shocked silence, everyone processing the revelation that they had been fooled by a performance and had celebrated a predator. Pastor Williams approached Jerome slowly with tears in his eyes, apologizing for the church's blindness and explaining that they had believed Bernard's mask without questioning the man beneath it. Victoria approached next with ruined makeup and a broken voice, saying she knew sorry would never be enough, but needed Jerome to understand that losing him was the biggest mistake she would ever make in her entire life. She explained that Darnell was already showing his true colors as controlling and possessive, exactly the opposite of everything Bernard had promised, and she had traded gold for fool's gold because she was scared and shallow and stupid. Jerome looked at her for a long moment before saying that her regret was something she would have to live with because apologies couldn't undo the public humiliation or restore the trust she had shattered so casually and completely. Darnell stormed over and demanded that Victoria leave with him immediately because these people were beneath them. But Victoria told him quietly that he was beneath them all and announced that they were finished. Darnell looked incredulous, unable to believe Victoria was breaking up with him for Jerome, but she explained that she was breaking up with him for herself because she finally understood that character mattered more than car dealerships. Mr. Carl stepped forward from the crowd, where he had been watching everything unfold, pulling an envelope from his jacket and announcing that he had been planning to wait for a better time. But this moment seemed perfect. He explained that he was retiring and selling Carl's auto body to Jerome with owner financing and affordable payments because Jerome had been running the place better than him for 2 years and customers specifically requested Jerome by name for their repairs. The envelope contained business valuation documents and purchase terms, all official and real, and offering Jerome ownership of the garage, where he had grown from a car-washing kid into a master mechanic. Mr. Carl asked Darnell if Jerome still seemed like nobody, now that he owned a successful business, questioning what Darnell actually owned, besides his father's money and unearned privilege. The church erupted in applause and celebration, while Jerome stood there holding the envelope with shaking hands, barely able to process this unexpected blessing, arriving in the middle of chaos and revelation. Jerome addressed the crowd one final time, explaining that he planned to reclaim Mama Ruth's house through the courts and transform it into something she would have loved, a community center offering free after-school tutoring and job training as a real legacy rather than a fake charity scheme. Pastor Williams gripped Jerome's shoulder and promised that the church would support that vision, however possible. And the church mothers surrounded Jerome with apologies and blessings and promises to spread the truth throughout the community. Victoria stayed at the back, watching everything without trying to approach again, just observing with visible regret in her eyes as she witnessed the man she had rejected being celebrated and elevated by people who actually understood his worth. Simone walked beside Jerome as he left the church that evening, commenting that he had handled everything with more grace than most people could manage under similar circumstances of betrayal and vindication. Jerome credited Mama Ruth for teaching him grace and dignity, and Simone smiled while revealing that the prosecutor expected Bernard to face 15 to 20 years in prison when combining all the charges across multiple victims and jurisdictions. Jerome asked if justice felt good, and after thinking about it, he answered that it felt necessary but not satisfying because Mama Ruth was still gone, and the years Bernard had stolen couldn't be recovered or returned. That night, Jerome sat in his truck outside Mama Ruth's house, the one that would legally be his again soon, watching lights in the upstairs window where tenants lived, who didn't yet know their landlord was heading to prison for his crimes against the vulnerable and trusting. The trial happened 6 months later, with Bernard pleading not guilty to all charges, despite overwhelming evidence from multiple sources and victims. His expensive lawyers, paid for with stolen money from elderly victims, tried to paint Jerome as unstable and vindictive and obsessed with destroying his successful cousin out of jealousy. But the evidence was devastating and undeniable across days of testimony from forensic experts and banking investigators and elderly victims who took the stand in wheelchairs to describe how Bernard had stolen their life savings while bringing them flowers. Dr. Cross testified about the forged signature with scientific precision, and the bank's fraud division presented years of unauthorized transfers showing systematic theft from the most vulnerable clients. One woman named Miss Dorothy, 89 years old and crying, described how Bernard had convinced her to consolidate accounts before slowly draining $40,000 over 2 years, while calling her weekly and making her feel special and valued. Victoria testified about the conspiracy to destroy Jerome's relationship, explaining how Bernard had orchestrated the public humiliation as entertainment while feeding her lies about Jerome's prospects and character. The prosecutor asked why Bernard would go to such elaborate lengths to destroy his own cousin's happiness, and Victoria answered in a shaking voice that Bernard said Jerome was getting too comfortable and that poor people needed to remember their place, and watching Jerome fail would be entertaining for those who understood how the world really worked. Darnell testified under subpoena, squirming on the witness stand, as he admitted that Bernard had approached him with a business opportunity involving Jerome's public humiliation in exchange for connections to wealthy clients from the bank. The prosecutor asked if he participated in someone's degradation for business contacts, and Darnell tried to explain that Bernard made it sound like they were helping Victoria escape an obsessive situation. The jury's faces hardened with disgust as Darnell described the arrangement that turned a man's heartbreak into a networking opportunity for used car salesmen and fraudulent bankers. The defense had no credible witnesses willing to testify for Bernard because everyone he had impressed had learned the truth about his character and crimes. The jury deliberated for only 3 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all counts, and at sentencing Bernard finally showed genuine emotion while crying and apologizing and begging for mercy from a judge who had heard too many similar excuses from privileged criminals. Judge Thornton, a black woman in her 60s with no patience for manipulation, explained that Bernard hadn't made mistakes but had orchestrated systematic theft from vulnerable people while psychologically torturing his cousin for amusement. And these weren't errors, but deliberate cruelty requiring serious consequences. She sentenced him to 18 years in prison, with full restitution to all victims and a lifetime ban from banking or finance. And as they led Bernard away, he looked at Jerome one last time, with pure rage behind his tears. Bernard said they could have shared Mama Ruth's love and the community's respect, but Jerome took everything for himself, and Jerome responded simply that he never took anything, while Bernard couldn't stand that love couldn't be stolen or forged or manipulated like insurance documents and property deeds. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed for statements, but Jerome gave only one sentence, explaining that justice had been served, and now they needed to rebuild what Bernard had tried to destroy. Miss Dorothy hugged Jerome while crying and thanking him for speaking up, because without his courage, they never would have discovered how badly they'd been victimized by someone they trusted. The other victims expressed similar gratitude, and one man named Mr. Phillips said that Mama Ruth had raised Jerome right, and she would be proud of his strength and integrity. Victoria waited by Jerome's truck at a respectful distance, and when he walked over, she explained that she wasn't asking for forgiveness, but wanted him to know she was in therapy dealing with her issues around money and status and self-worth. Jerome acknowledged that her self-improvement was good, and Victoria mentioned that Darnell had revealed his true controlling nature once pressure mounted, and they were finished completely. She said she hoped Jerome would someday find someone who recognized his worth from the beginning, instead of needing to lose him to appreciate him. And Jerome responded that she needed to find herself first and figure out who she was when nobody was watching or judging. Victoria walked away, and Jerome felt nothing watching her leave. No anger or longing or regret, just emptiness where love used to live before betrayal killed it. Simone appeared beside Jerome and informed him that Judge Thornton had signed the order returning Mama Ruth's property, giving current tenants 30 days to find new housing before Jerome could begin renovations for the community center that the church had already raised $20,000 to support. 1 year later, Jerome stood in front of the Ruth Mitchell Community Center, looking at the repainted exterior with new windows and a sign featuring Mama Ruth's picture and her favorite saying about love being action rather than performance. Inside, 15 kids sat at tables doing homework with volunteer tutors, while adults attended free job training classes, learning computer skills and resume writing and interview preparation for better opportunities. Mr. Carl taught Saturday auto mechanics workshops, passing on the same skills and knowledge he had given Jerome years ago when he was a curious kid washing cars. Pastor Williams ran Wednesday financial literacy programs, teaching people how to avoid predators like Bernard and protect their assets while building real wealth through honest work and smart decisions. The church mothers provided free meals twice weekly, and Jerome managed the entire operation while running Mitchell's Auto Repair, the renamed garage that was booming with business from customers who valued quality work and honest pricing and integrity. He had hired 3 mechanics and an office manager, and was already considering expansion to a second location because demand kept growing from satisfied customers who spread word about the business through their communities. The community center was his real pride, though, as every kid walking through those doors reminded him of his younger self, hungry to learn and needing guidance and deserving chances that the world often denied to people from their circumstances and backgrounds. Jerome had established the Ruth Mitchell Scholarship, providing $5,000 annually to students pursuing technical training or trade schools, requiring no fancy essays, but just demonstrated work ethic and character that couldn't be faked or purchased. This year's recipient was 17-year-old Shanice, who wanted to become an electrician and reminded Jerome of himself at that age, quiet and determined and brilliant with her hands. At the ceremony, Shanice gave a speech explaining that Miss Ruth never met her, but Mr. Jerome said she would have believed in her anyway, because the center was about believing in people and giving them tools rather than sympathy and teaching them they were worthy of good things. Jerome thought about Bernard, sitting in a prison cell, serving year 1 of 18. Thought about Victoria rebuilding her life as an elementary school teacher, helping low-income kids. Thought about Darnell, who had filed bankruptcy after his dealerships collapsed when customers fled following the scandal. But mostly he thought about Mama Ruth and her weathered hands braiding his hair when he was small, her voice reading Bible stories before bed, her unshakable faith that love would always win if you gave it time and truth and consistent action. She had been right about everything that mattered, and Jerome had lost money and time and a relationship he thought was real, but he had gained something more valuable, which was proof that character outlasts conspiracy and truth defeats manipulation, and real legacy isn't what you take, but what you give to others without expecting anything in return. As Jerome locked up the community center that evening, a young man approached nervously and introduced himself as Terence, explaining that his grandmother, Miss Dorothy, talked constantly about Jerome, helping her recover stolen money from that criminal banker. Terence explained that he was trying to get his GED and find honest work, but nobody would give him a chance because of his record from stupid mistakes he made at 16 when he didn't know better. Jerome looked at this kid and saw the hope mixed with fear in his eyes, saw himself 10 years ago, standing at similar crossroads between despair and possibility. He asked if Terence liked cars, and the kid's face lit up as he described working on his uncle's truck before his uncle passed away from cancer. Jerome told him to come by the shop Monday morning at 7 sharp to see what he could do. And Terence asked if he was serious because nobody else had offered him any real opportunities. Jerome promised it was real, but explained that Terence got one chance and had to show up on time and work hard and be honest, because those were the only requirements that actually mattered for success. Terence walked away, practically floating with joy and gratitude, and Jerome got in his paid-off truck and drove through the old neighborhood, past the church, where they found him as a baby, and the grocery store where he bagged at 12, and the apartment where Mama Ruth raised him with nothing but love and wisdom and unshakable faith in his potential. Everything looked different now, or maybe Jerome was looking at everything differently, with eyes opened by betrayal and vindication and growth. His phone buzzed with a text from Simone, announcing a board meeting next week to discuss adding small business mentorship programs to the community center's offerings, and Jerome smiled while typing that He was absolutely interested because Mama Ruth would love that idea. At home, he made a simple dinner of fried chicken and greens using Mama Ruth's recipes, eating at the table she had given him, which was the one piece of furniture he kept from her apartment. On the wall hung her photograph showing that beautiful smile and those wise eyes that had seen him when nobody else bothered looking. And Jerome spoke to her picture like she could hear him across whatever distance separated the living from the dead. He told her they had done it, not the way he expected, and not the easy way, but they had succeeded in turning her house into something that fed people, and her name into something that lifted people, and her love into something that still worked in the world through his hands and heart. Jerome swore he felt her presence and her pride surrounding him like a warm blanket on a cold night. And he finally understood what she had been trying to teach him all along, through her actions and words and sacrifices. It was never about the money Bernard stole, or Victoria's betrayal, or proving anything to anyone who doubted his worth or potential. It was about becoming the kind of man who could stand in the ruins of betrayal and choose to build rather than destroy, who could face humiliation and respond with dignity rather than revenge, who could lose everything material and discover he still had the only thing that mattered, which was unshakable character that couldn't be stolen or forged or destroyed by anyone's schemes or lies. That was what Mama Ruth had given him through 17 years of sacrifice and love, not money or status or connections to powerful people, but a foundation that no one could steal or forge or destroy, no matter how hard they tried. On that foundation, Jerome was building something beautiful that would outlast him and Bernard and Victoria and everyone who had underestimated him based on his circumstances rather than his character. Bernard thought he was teaching Jerome his place in a rigid hierarchy of worth, but instead he taught Jerome his real power to transform pain into purpose and betrayal into blessing and loss into legacy that would help hundreds of people for generations. Victoria thought she was trading up when she chose wealth over character, but instead she traded away something irreplaceable and learned too late that some values can't be measured in car dealerships or designer clothes. Jerome had thought he lost everything during that terrible night at the engagement party, but instead he discovered what he was really made of beneath the surface that people judge so quickly and superficially. Today, Mitchell's Auto Repair employed 12 people, and the Ruth Mitchell Community Center served over 200 families weekly. And the Scholarship Fund had helped 23 students pursue their dreams of better lives through honest work. Bernard was serving year 1 of his sentence, while Jerome prayed for him occasionally, not because he had forgotten what Bernard did, but because Mama Ruth would want him to remember that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, but means refusing to let bitterness poison your future and potential. Victoria sent Christmas cards that Jerome didn't respond to, but didn't throw away either, acknowledging her reported transformation into an elementary school teacher, helping kids from low-income families find their potential. Darnell had apparently moved out of state to start over somewhere else, and Jerome hoped he learned something valuable from his fall from grace and privilege. As for Jerome himself, he was still that mechanic they had laughed at and mocked, still the orphan nobody wanted when they left him outside a church on a frozen February morning. But he was also the man Mama Ruth believed he could become, through her patient love and wise guidance, the man who turned betrayal into buildings that served his community and pain into programs that lifted struggling families and rejection into redemption that inspired others facing similar challenges. They had tried to teach him he was worthless and powerless and destined for permanent poverty, but instead they proved he was priceless and powerful beyond their limited understanding of what creates real value in this world. Jerome wanted anyone hearing this story to understand that their worth isn't measured by what others think or what you own, but by your character and how you treat people when nobody important is watching. He encouraged people to subscribe and like and share this video if it reminded them that character is the only currency that matters, and real wealth is integrity, and true legacy is love in action rather than empty words. He asked people to leave comments, sharing their own stories, because he read every single one and believed that everyone's story mattered, and everyone's struggle had purpose, and everyone's pain could become someone else's breakthrough if they were brave enough to share it honestly. Jerome reflected that we're all just mechanics in our own way, fixing what's broken in ourselves and our communities, building what's beautiful from the raw materials of our experiences, proving that the grease on our hands or the circumstances of our birth don't define us, because the love in our hearts does. People could steal your money and forge your signature and break your heart into pieces that feel impossible to reassemble. But they could never touch your character, because that belonged to you alone and was forged through choices and actions rather than circumstances and accidents of birth. Jerome signed off by speaking directly to Mama Ruth, as if she could hear him from heaven, asking if they had done good with the foundation she built through 17 years of sacrifice, and answering his own question with certainty that yes, they had done real good together across the barrier between life and death.